Hey, Low Code Approach listeners, this is Wendy Haddad. Before we jump into this week's episode, I wanted to let you know that we are starting to plan for the next season, and we want to make sure we hear from you on what is most important and relevant in terms of the topics that we'll be choosing. So if you could open a web browser and pop over to aka.ms/low code topic request, that's aka.ms/low code topic request, all one word. Fill out that brief survey on what topics and what subjects, what guests you might want to hear from. And who knows, maybe it'll make it into the next season of the podcast. Thanks so much and happy listening.
Hey everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Low Code Approach. I'm Sean Feeney, a Senior Product Marketing Manager on the Power Platform team, and I'm joined by...
I'm Wendy Haddad. I'm a Senior Cloud Solution Architect, Delivery Lead, and a former Microsoft customer, and I am joined by...
Everyone's center on the sound of our voices while we enable you with this podcast. I'm Ken Aguillard, and here with us today is Grant Archibald. Grant, how are you?
Doing well. Thanks very much. So yeah, I'm Grant Archibald. I'm a Senior Program Manager in the PowerCat Customer Advisory team and looking forward to talking about approvals with you today.
Yeah, Grant, we're so excited to have you on. And I think we want to talk about the Business Approval Kit. So before we start jumping into all the questions, let's start with the easiest one. What is the Business Approval Kit?
Business Approval Kit is basically a set of components, low-code components, Power Apps, Power Automate, and database components that build on the out-of-the-box components to make it easier to create approval workflows.
Nice. Okay. And so like you said, there's a whole bunch of improvements on top of the normal approval workflows. Like give me an example of some of those improvements. Like what are people looking for? What are organizations looking for these approvals that don't come out of the box?
I think the key thing is how do we separate out the triggering process from the actual individual steps that make up a common business approval. So typically what we see the process is you might start with some kind of connector where your source of truth is coming from, and you want to start a business approval process. And you want to keep the number of steps and I'd say a Power Automate process as simple as possible. And then the second part is how do we go model an approval process? And typically those tend to have multiple stages of approvals. So for example, it may start with I want to make an approval, and based on some information, I may need to escalate that to my manager. They may need to do an approval, and based on that series of steps, at the end of it, say, here's what the outcome of that overall approval process is. So it's kind of how do we simplify those multiple stages of approvals that we commonly see in an approval process.
So Grant, help me understand here because, and maybe part of this is you explaining the PowerCat team a little bit more, but we have something that's built in product. Now you're saying that there's an improvement, but that's not built on the product. Is this eventually going to be replacing what we already have? Is this always going to coexist? Why do we need two things?
Yeah, great question. I think generally all things we do in our kits, they build on the out-of-the-box product functionality. So inside the approvals kit, we use the out-of-the-box approvals connector, but we add some database to control the state as you go through all those different stages. We add some Power Automate flows that trigger all those steps, and we add some applications on top of that. So it's wrapping a whole set of components together that you could individually create, but this makes that process of starting the process a lot easier, so you don't have to do all those steps yourself. Over time, like a lot of things that we do in the customer advisory team, is to take an idea, see a gap where customers have given us feedback around how do we need to improve things. Then as we see customers adopting a key feature, work with my core engineering program managers and look at how they could become part of the product over time. So we're going to see that in other similar things our teams created. For example, the ALM Accelerator. We built the ALM Accelerator a couple of years ago that enabled you to go through that process of building low-code applications that integrate with source control. Over time, we saw that was a really popular pattern. That's now part of pipelines, which is part of the product. So we're going to see the approvals kit go through a similar process that we've done with the ALM Accelerator. So as we see this as a popular pattern, work with my core engineering program managers to see what are the core features that out of the approvals kit can be reborn in the product.
So Grant, I'm just going to rip the proverbial Band-Aid off right here. What does it cost? What do they need to run it? Let's get into it.
Excellent. So let's go to the licensing question then. Okay, so one of the things we do within our kits, we don't design around particular licensing. We try build for the best experience. So to use this, you're going to need a premium license because it does take advantage of Dataverse. We use custom connectors in the process. So you will need both a Power Apps license for the administrators that are building these approvals processes, and you will need a Power Automate licenses for the cloud flows that we trigger off our Dataverse tables.
Any other additional licenses or maybe capacity considerations for Dataverse, for example?
So you'll need because it stores all the data for this, it's going to be stored inside Dataverse. So you'll need your Dataverse capacity licensing, and you'll have to think about, how long do you want to retain your data over time? And that's a choice of how long do you want to keep your data inside Dataverse. You could take advantage of things like Synapse Link or Fabric to go put that out to your lake if you want to go store that data on a longer term basis. There are other things that we have in integration with Microsoft Entra in terms of how do you go access your Microsoft Graph. So one of the things we added to the features recently was the ability to go access your mailbox settings, which is a really important thing if you want to take advantage of people's out of office settings and go look for your manager. So there's other parts there that we integrate with Microsoft Entra to make that an easy process to deal with common scenarios like somebody's out of office. How do I go find the time they're out of office? Who are their manager? How do you go escalate to those managers and make that process easier? So there are parts that we integrate optionally with Microsoft Entra to make that approval process easier.
I do want to clarify real fast for you, Grant. So when you said that it does require some of the premium tools for the best experience, and I think we're going to dive a little bit deeper into what the best experience means in a few minutes and why. But when you say that obviously has licensing implications, let's say I've got this approval workflow running. Let's say I'm pointing it to a list or a site or a team or something where people are interacting and it's triggering things automatically. Does every user need to have this premium license, or is it just the owner of the workflow that needs to have the premium license, or maybe just the approver and the owner?
Great question. I think one thing, the end approver themselves, it still uses the out-of-the-box standard approval connector. So the approver is still going to get an approval that turns up into their email, their Teams channel, or a mobile application to the approval. That's just a standard connector, and you don't need any special licensing but beyond actually being part of the environment. Because you still need to be part of the Power Platform environment, but you could use your standard connector for that. The premium licensing is more on if you're what I call an approvals administrator, where you want to go design and author the approval process, that you need a Power App to go manage that. And you'll need a Power Automate license for the back-end cloud flows that trigger off the Dataverse tables. So the owner of that cloud flow would need the appropriate Power Automate license that has the ability to run premium connectors.
So we know what licensing is required, but what about the installation process or the deployment process of this? What roles or permissions are required to set this up?
So there's three groups of permissions we need. One is just starting at the basic one of Microsoft Entra. So there's a couple of application IDs that you need registered to enable you to interact, one with Dataverse and the second one with optionally with your Microsoft Graph. So that's the first initial kind of setup, is setting up those Microsoft Entra configurations. And we use those inside the custom connectors that we're going to go install the approvals kit. So the second one is in the way the approvals kit works, it is just a Power Platform solution. You can deploy it into an environment. So you're going to need system customizer rights in an environment to go import that solution and go set up the custom connectors that make up the platform. And the third is more at a application level and a Dataverse level, looking at who do you share the applications with, and then look at what are the normal out-of-the-box Dataverse permissions that you could apply in terms of giving people role-based access security to the data that exists in Dataverse. So it's kind of those three levels. Intro, the one is around normal administration rights for importing and managing a solution. And the third is more the operational controls around sharing applications and Dataverse permissions.
So, Grant, approvals are so important. And sometimes I would say there's a couple of categories of approvals, right? There's just team functionality, just automating simple workflows. But then there are the approvals that we need to retain. We need a record that this approval actually happened. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about, first of all, is this system, is the Power Platform designed for that? And if so, what tools do we have in place to protect that record of the approval or retain it or secure it within our system?
Great question. I think the key thing behind this is the data structure that we have behind the approvals kit is Dataverse. So Dataverse has all the standard auditability capability for changes and updates. So you can audit the beginning to end start of the process in terms of who designed the workflow, who published a version of the workflow, which particular instance have we got, and then when we do a particular approval itself, all of those are recorded. Each node and stage are recorded inside Dataverse. So it kind of gives you a lineage from starting to ending in terms of what that process looks like from a data lifecycle of designing, publishing, and then actually running the approval itself.
So Grant, let me maybe ask a different question, because I feel like you opened the door once you said Dataverse in a little bit of the question that Wendy asked. So this might be a two-part question here. Dataverse is fantastic, and I absolutely love the security model inside of it, right? As opposed to, say, using things within a SQL server or maybe a SharePoint list, or even an Excel backend, as we've seen folks do. But our customers are often very concerned about their data privacy and data security. So we know that it's in Dataverse and they own their data, but I wonder, have we given any considerations to things like laws in California, Canada, GDPR, and so on, when we actually store the data?
I think the first thing to realize is it's stored within Dataverse in terms of when you create your environment, you can set the location of that particular environment. So for example, if I'm a multinational company, I may have an environment in North America, I may have one in Japan, I may have another one in Europe. Each one of those environments, the actual approval data itself would be located within the Dataverse instance for each of those environments. So you can make a choice in terms of which environment you go deploy the approvals kit to, and then you can make a choice of how do you want to aggregate that data across those multiple environments. You could keep it at an environment basis, or you might say, I might want to aggregate data across one or more of those environments to give me a holistic view of those approval processes. So it becomes an organizational choice in terms of what's the level of granularity or the level of aggregation you want to provide on the approvals.
So given that, what you just said, thank you for the answer, by the way. I love that we are addressing the fact by allowing the customers to land their data in the appropriate geos or host their data in the appropriate geos. But I'm also curious is, how are we handling segregation of duty inside of that? So who has access to the data within the database by default?
Okay. The biggest thing there is, if we can look at it from a Dataverse point of view, is looking at how you apply security roles. So you're going to have natural kind of breakdowns in terms of how people are going to use this. So if we look at the Dataverse model behind the approvals kit, there's three sets of tables. One is just defining what the approval workflow itself, just defining what the stages and nodes and recurrence and those kinds of sets of data. And that could be assigned to a security role of, say, an approval administrator. So some people may be able to view that, but other people may have edit and update rights on the definition of that. There's a second set of tables we say, okay, I want to go publish a particular version. And you have control over who are the people that can actually publish a version of the approval. So I could have fine-grained control saying, I may give Wendy access to go author a version of the approval, but I'm only going to give rights to you, Ken, to actually go publish that particular version of the approval. And then the third set of tables are actually our runtime tables, where we store the actual individual instances of the approval. And that means that anyone, so Ken, Wendy, Sean, could all have access to go run the actual individual instance of the approval. So there's kind of three sets of tables, and you can apply three sets of permissions depending on what's the level of permissions you want across the system.
So we understand the Dataverse implications of using the approval kit. How does this impact an organization's, or is there any impact on an organization's environment strategy when deploying the approval kit?
I think the first thing is it is based on your environment in terms of, is the actual instance of the approval kit deployed to an environment? There are some things you may want to think about from an environment strategy in terms of if you apply an ALM process where you want to take dev, test, and production. You're still going to have your standard deployment process to go deploy your Power Platform solution that triggers this process. So for example, one of the things we have in our Learn modules is an example of Contoso Coffee, where you've got a Dataverse table where somebody wants to go order a coffee machine. And when you add a new record to the Dataverse table, it will then trigger an approval process. So there's going to be a process of deploying that solution via your standard ALM process. And then, as I talked about for the database tables, you then need to move the data definition of that particular approval process between your environments. When you think about your environment strategy, you need to think about what your dev, test, and production looks like and what your data pipeline would look like to move those definitions of those approval processes through whatever organizational pattern that you want to set up in terms of either move and make changes make directly into production, or maybe you've got a policy where you want to go apply a more rigorous dev, test, or production process.
Grant, who's using this? I'm really curious about any success stories or, use cases, and especially even if you can't talk about who, but the use cases there of examples and inspiration, and even if this can be tailored, right, to specific examples and specific workflows.
Yeah, so generally, if you look at the approvals connector itself, the standard approvals connector, is something really common across our large customers. So this is across a lot of organizations. Approvals is a common scenario generally. And picking a specific example I've seen, talking to a consulting company recently where they're doing software development projects. And they've got an approval process where they want to go through, how do we go validate a design specification for a document? It needs to go through a security review and an architecture review before the project would actually get approved. And that tends to have multiple stages in that process, where the first stage may get assigned to a IT security consultant to review that document. Depending on the outcome of that review, they may then say, I may need a security architect to do a deeper review. So that's another set of approvals after that. And then depending on how those first two stages go, that may need to go to an open source review for any components that are made a part of that solution. So that was a good example of there's multiple stages of naturally as part of that business process that needed to be modeled. That there's a document that needs to be reviewed. That then goes into an approval process. That approval process can contain multiple stages of approval, which each person could accept or reject. And then at the end of it, you want to see what the overall outcome of that approval is. Was that document approved or not? And who are the people that approved that document as part of that process? The idea of that is that it would show, we start the process, that document could have been stored in the SharePoint location. It then could go through the approval process, record all the individual steps of that approval, see where it is in the process, and at the end of that, see, is that document approved or not? And some of the questions people have is like, could we put a hold lock on that document while we're going through the approval process? So use the connectors of Power Platform to go back and lock the original document while that approval process is in train. And then at the end of the process, once it's approved, maybe the document is unlocked.
So Grant, I'm a little curious here, trying not to overload you with a whole ton of questions here. One.
You're totally grilling him. You totally have like the spotlight on.
Wow.
I know this is an audio podcast, but just so you know, like he's sitting across the desk, the light's in his face, and we're sitting there.
Keeps on banging on the desk.
With that said, let's turn up the heat here, Grant. How does the approval kit keep up with the rapid changes within the platform itself? This week alone, I know folks don't know exactly the week that we're recording, but I've seen, I think 6 or 7 features go GA that could probably directly impact the business approval kit. So how do you all keep up with that pace?
That's a great question. I think one of the things we have the approvals, we generally have a monthly release cycle, and within any given month, there's a number of changes that could occur. There's platform level changes that could occur and land within a particular release wave that could be applied. There's other things on top of that in terms of how we globally roll this out. So some of the features may be available in some of our early release regions before they reach maybe say North America. So there's that kind of level of changes. And then there's changes that we introduce ourselves in the kit. And then the third level of changes is what are the changes the customer could go add on top of that to go customize the kit for their requirements. So generally what we see is that it's a large kind of test matrix of terms of how do we maintain confidence in changing those things and making sure we don't get regression issues. So it's something I think about a lot in time is, given we've got a very rapid update cycle, how do we maintain the quality of the solutions we create in a way that reacts to those platform level changes, reacts to the new features we keep adding month on month, and also enable customers to also customize that process. So a lot of that we're looking to do is how do we add additional automation in that process to validate that the kit works over time across those different versions, across different geos and enable eventually the customer to also go run and verify those tests so that when they go install it, they can go verify that over time. So I think that's one of the things we're looking to do is align with, as we make changes in the product itself, to use those features to automate more of that process so we can scale to that it's going to change as quickly and with confidence.
Okay, listen, Grant, Ken, Wendy, we've been recording for like 20 minutes, let's say that, give or take. And I have yet to hear the word Copilot come up once, and I'm freaking out. How have we not brought this term up yet? Grant, let's talk a little bit about like roadmap, future state for Approval Kit. Is Copilot a part of this feature set coming up later? What can you and what can you not talk about?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think definitely Copilot is something part of the roadmap that we're looking at. And there's two ways that we see that Copilot could be really useful here. So one is in terms of how do we help the initial person do the triggering process? So for example, how would I use natural language to say, I would like to go create an approval when a machine request is created, and I want to then map the data out of that machine request to start an approval. So that's the first way that we could look at using natural language. The second way is like, how do I help you use natural language to go edit the flows? So I want to create a stage. The first stage needs to be a self-approval. And then I want to create a second stage. And if the amount of that machine request, so if I'm ordering a really expensive coffee machine, and if it's above $4,000, it's going to go to my manager. And if it's really one of the uber expensive coffee machines, maybe it's going to go to my skip level manager. And I want to be able to use natural language to go define those stages and nodes in a way that's easy and relatable to go edit and update those Cloudflow to the actual approval process. So those two things we're looking at doing in terms of how do we simplify the triggering process and the authoring process as part of the approval kit.
So Grant, two things. One, Sean used Copilot to actually ask Copilot if he should ask about Copilot. That's how we got the Copilot question.
Pretty accurate.
And then can you tell us a little bit about where are we headed with this business approval kit? What's the roadmap looking like for us? I know we kind of touched on it a little bit, maybe when Sean asked Copilot for the Copilot question, which Copilot gave the question for, but
Sounds like a Dr.
can
Seuss
you
book.
elaborate on this for us? I fulfilled my daily Copilot, mentions today. So
Your quota.
Yeah.
Your Copilot bingo card has been successfully filled.
absolutely not.
So some of the roadmap we're looking at is just continuing to personalize the process. The small things we're looking at doing is like, how do you go change and personalize the message depending on the stage or node you're at? So that's one of the things, just incrementally and make the process more personalized so you can actually go see where are we in the process and personalize the message. I think the bigger part though, and it kind of comes back to that comment of like, our goal as the customer advisory team is to work directly with customers to hear the feedback of what's important to you. And then work with the other core engineering teams to say, over time, what are the features that we've got, and then integrate that into the product. So I think the partnership with the core engineering team enables us to accelerate the ability to get features into the product. How do we take advantage of the investments we're making in Copilot, apply that to the approvals kit? Look at a way that where this becomes useful across a number of customers, across a number of industries, look at how we go apply that and make that as part of an out-of-the-box experience of the product. So that's something I'm having an active conversation with my other PM counterparts in terms of how do we convert this to an out-of-the-box experience over time.
Grant, as we get close to ending our episode, I know we grilled you at the beginning, so I'll end with a fun question here. I want to know the backstory of this. You said you talk to customers, you work closely with customers. So what was it that you saw that it inspired this need that made you decide this is where we need to invest our time and we need a specific approval kit that you were seeing? Like what led to this?
I think the thing that really led to this is how do we simplify the process? How do we not get caught in the minutiae of all the particular small steps to go make an approval process and just focus on what's the process we're trying to model and make that process simpler? Because I think sometimes it can feel a little bit overpowering to say, okay, I can build all these small steps using connectors, but that can actually grow to a large number of connectors relatively quickly, depending on how complex you want to create the business process. And the idea was to simplify this process in terms of, I've got one set of people, some group of humans that just want to model a business process and approval process. And I want to make it as simple as possible for those group of people, as opposed to spending time on all the individual connectors and the minutiae that to actually make that process work.
Very cool. Hey, Grant, so like when you said we're unfortunately going to have to wrap up the episode, if listeners are now coming across the business approval kit, what steps can they take to further familiarize themselves? Like what documents, any videos you recommend that they go and watch after listening to this podcast?
I think the first thing to do is start with our Learn documentation. It'll give you an idea of what the approvals kit is. It'll do the comparison between the standard connector and what you get in the approvals kit. It'll talk through how it works, what the data model is, some of the key things we covered today. There's also a Learn module alongside this. It will kind of give you a self-paced learning to give you an idea of how you go step through this process. So it'll start with a ready-made application and then show you how you incrementally go take that application as a starting point and add an approval process on that.
Nice. Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining us, Grant. We really appreciate your time on this. And we'd love to check in with you later to see, once some of these new advancements come out for the approval kit, to check and see how it's going, and then to, maybe do another 20, 30 minutes of grilling you.
Look forward. We can do some more Copilot bingo.
And then we'll be friendly at the end.
Yeah, seriously. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Grant. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Looking forward to it, and look forward to getting people using the kit, get their feedback, and how we go this incremental process of improving it based on your feedback, and eventually get to a point that we can work with our core engineering team to make this part of the product.